Hello, welcome back to Economics with me, Professor Ledwinski. What we're going to do today is continue on our Unit 7, thinking about efficiency in markets and interventions and restrictions. What we're going to be focusing on is looking today at the incidence of taxation. So how the burden of a tax is not just about who pays it, right? So it's not about just who is sending money to the government. So let's get into first some definitions around the incidence of taxation. First, there's the boring one, the statutory incidence of taxation. This is simply who's required to do the work of sending the money to the government. So when politicians talk about a tax on landlords or a tax on producers, this is what they're talking about, right? So the ones that are dealing with the statutes are talking about the statutory incidence. However, this isn't necessarily who's made better or worse off. We have the idea as economists of the economic incidence of taxation. This is the person who actually ends up paying the tax. For example, if we had a $10 tax that producers were paying, but they're able to raise the price by $10, are they really paying it, or are they just passing that tax right along to consumers and consumers are paying 100% of it? That's the idea of a difference between the statutory incidence of taxation and the economic incidence of taxation. So in this example, consumers are paying in the economic sense. Let's jump into a graphical view. So here we have a tax paid by producers. We're going to look at the transacted price, the out-of-pocket cost, the take-home amount. This is from what we did previously. Now, let's look at how things changed versus how things used to be. Consumers, they were paying P2, this price. Now they're paying more, right? They're paying P1. So when we think about the incidence for consumers, it's how much has the price risen. This is the consumer tax, the price difference here. And we're thinking always in terms of their out-of-pocket amount. For producers, they used to take home P2. Now they're taking home less. They're taking home P3. Right? Their take-home amount has dropped. So the producer incidence of taxation is the difference here, P2 minus P3. We also often like to express these as what share of the tax are consumers having, what share of the tax are producers having. In that case, you just divide the change in take-home and the change in out-of-pocket by the tax amount. All right, now let's look at how this economic incidence of taxation looks when instead of having a tax paid by producers, we have a tax paid by consumers. So here our transacted price instead of being P1 is P3. However, the out-of-pocket, that's still P1, and the take-home is still P3. So we have changed here the statutory incidence of taxation. It's now paid by consumers. However, consumers used to pay P2, now they pay P1. The economic incidence is the difference, P1 minus P2. Producers used to take home P2, now they take home P3. The economic incidence is the difference, and the shares as well. Let's compare here. So tax paid by producers, tax paid by consumers, transacted price was different based on who paid the tax. The out-of-pocket did not change. The take-home amount did not change. The consumer incidence did not change. The producer incidence did not change. So this is a really important and powerful idea from economics. The economics incidence of taxation is independent of the statutory incidence. In other words, who's made worse off because of a tax is not dependent on who has to send the money from the government. Now, what does it depend on? I hinted earlier that the price depended on the elasticities, and so let's look at that. Let's look at the elasticity of demand. So let's say we have less elastic demand. So in the light blue, this is sort of the first one, the original one. And then we have our tax. And then we have our producer's incidence. It is smaller. P5 is higher. And the consumer incidence is bigger. P4 is greater, kind of P1. All right. Now let's look at and so what we're seeing is less elastic demand means the consumers end up paying a higher share of the tax. Less elastic means more rigid, less other options. And so when you have less other options as a consumer, you end up absorbing more of the tax. There's less switching that goes on. Let's look at the extreme example where we have perfectly inelastic demand. So when you have a tax on perfectly inelastic demand, you do shift it, but it kind of shifts over itself. And so for the suppliers, it looks like nothing really changes. The producers take home the same amount. Their incidence is 0. And the consumers, they pay everything. So in the extreme example of perfectly inelastic demand, consumers pay the entire tax. Now let's look at the incidence of taxation and the elasticity of supply. When we have less elastic supply, again, here was our original supply. We're making it less responsive to price changes. What we see is that there is a bigger change in drop in price for the take-home amount, and a smaller change in terms of the consumer incidence, in terms of the change of their out-of-pocket amount. And so the less inelastic supply, meaning the producers have fewer options, the more producers are forced to bear the burden of the tax. In the extreme case where we have perfectly inelastic supply, what we see is that the price that the producers take home drops exactly by the tax. Their incidence is the full tax, while consumers were paying P2 and they're still paying P2 out of pocket. The consumer burden of the tax is 0. And again, this won't matter whether the tax statutorily is placed on the consumer or the producer. So the economic incidence of taxation, to emphasize, it's determined by the responsiveness of demand and the responsiveness of supply, elasticities, in terms of how responsive they are to price change. There are nice formulas here as well that characterize the producer share and the consumer share in terms of elasticities. Right? So the higher the elasticity demand, this means that there are more options for the consumer. Producers end up bearing more. If producers have a larger more options, consumers bear more. If we wanted to turn these percentages into dollar amounts, we just multiply by the tax. So the intuition here is that the more options for consumers, it's easier to switch to another good. And then the smaller your tax burden is going to be. Conversely, when the producer has no other option, they bear the tax. Final reminder, the economic incidence of taxation, who ultimately pays, it does not depend on who is sending money to the government. All right, that is it for incidence. We have one last wrap up here and we'll conclude. But thank you for tuning in, and I hope you continue to watch. Take care.